Welcome to Dyed Green. I'm Max Sussman.
And I'm Kate McCabe.
Kate, what do you think people think about when they think about Ireland? Like, what's the first thing? What's like the first couple things?
Guinness, Jameson, potatoes, sheep.
Yes.
Rolling green hills, fields of Athen rye.
And why is it like...
Old people.
Why do you think that...
Cool sweaters.
Why do you think that people associate Guinness so strongly with Ireland when...
Because it's Irish beer.
I know, but other countries have beer. Other countries have breweries.
Peroni.
Right. But like when you say, what do you think of Ireland?
Dos Equis.
People name the beer. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's kind of like when you need a tissue, you ask for a Kleenex. What?
It's kind of like that.
No, I mean, they're like a quintessentially Irish brand.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is like...
this style of beer.
Right, exactly. Like, is there another country that when you ask people to name an association, not even a food and drink association, but like any association, there's like an actual specific brand or style of beer that comes up
I would actually
first?
say, yeah, and I would actually put this out there, and I don't know how Guinness would feel about it, but honestly, one could liken Guinness to like the Coca-Cola of Ireland, because I think people around the world associate Coca-Cola with the United States.
If you were like, if you were asked someone, what do you think of when you think of the United States? Like they would say McDonald's, Coca-Cola, guns.
Well, they certainly, certainly wouldn't say freedom. That's for sure.
Yeah. Let's move this conversation back to where we were. Anyways, I think it's really interesting that we have someone who is going to be on our show who can really talk a little bit about this and help kind of like talk about some of the underlying reasons and the cultural reasons and the historical reasons about why Ireland is so strongly associated with drinking pints and drinking Guinness in particular. And
yeah, and I would say, I mean, the book isn't really about Guinness per se. It's about the culture. It's about pint culture in Ireland, and it's also about pub culture, which I think is something that makes Ireland distinct, because a lot of countries have bars, but you don't, you might go to France or Italy or Spain and say you're really looking forward to drinking wine, but you don't say that you're looking forward to going to a bar. And it really is something unique about pub culture in Ireland that you really need to go there to find out more about.
Yeah, it's like a quintessential part of visiting Ireland is going to a pub, is drinking some Guinness. Ideally, you're hearing some music.
But it's not really about the beer. At least for me, it's not. It's about the camaraderie. It's about
everything that goes along with it.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember when I turned 21 and I was like, everything went from like basically drinking at like people's houses because you can't drink, unless you have a fake ID, and it switched over to drinking in bars. And I was like, I remember being at that age and being like, I don't really like going out to bars all the time. Like bar culture in the United States is like, it just feels like you're doing the same thing, but it's like louder and more annoying and more expensive than what you were doing like a year or two before.
Sure. And I think part of that is, at least when you're a younger person, is you're often going to a bar to get wasted. That's the point, is kind of where you end up, and not so much the experience of drinking pints with your friends.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it also, it also reminds me of, like how pubs are just basically, I mean, I'm sure there's for better or worse component of this, but how, pubs are just a part of the social fabric of Ireland, from small towns to big towns to neighborhoods. And in the US, especially in a lot of like not old cities, like that just doesn't exist. There's you go downtown for that kind of experience, and there's not like
you have a favorite bar,
like
maybe,
bar.
Yeah, but you don't have necessarily a local.
Yeah, where people have been going for years and generations. Even.
And let's not forget about the music in pubs, because that is something that is completely unparalleled. And sure, there's a lot of Irish pubs in the United States. Some of them are, better and more Irish than others. But I would say, we also don't have that music culture. And that's not to say that we don't have live music in bars, but these are people who go and, maybe they get paid a little bit, maybe they get free beer, but people go, once or twice a week or often every night to the bar, and they bring their instrument and they play with their friends, predominantly trad music, and people can go and they can join in.
Yeah, it's amazing. I guess it kind of reminds me of going out in Nashville, where there's music is a part of going out there in a way that it's not. I mean, I guess New Orleans is like that as well, where like music is a part of like going out, and you might not be going to see a concert. You might just be going out for dinner and to hang out with your friends, but there's music involved, and that's like what pubs in Ireland are like.
But imagine going to Nashville and having like the real like high, like top session musicians hanging out in the corner of the bar, not on stage, just doing improv, and having that be someone that if you're Brad from Ohio and you can play guitar and you brought it with you, you could just sit down with these people and just jam. It would be like that.
Yeah, Ireland is so cool. So we're really excited about our guest on this week's episode. She's the perfect person to talk about pub culture, pints, beer.
Guinness's world domination, but like not in like a sort of a kitschy souvenir shop type of way, but like really talking about like how these things are really a part of Irish culture, historically, socially, all this really good stuff. And we're really excited to dive in with her. Yeah, Ali Dunworth is a food writer, a journalist, an events producer, and she is the author of the recently published book, A Compendium of Irish Pints, The Culture, Customs, and Crack. So here's our conversation with Ali. I hope you enjoy it. Ali, thank you so much for being on Dyed Green.
Not at all. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk to you about all things pint related. But first, I thought that we could talk a little bit about your backstory and to hear you tell us a little bit more about where your interest in food comes from and how you started off in food journalism.
Well, like my interest in food, I suppose I grew up in a house where we were quite interested in food, which probably wasn't the norm in the 80s in Ireland, but my dad particularly was into food. So we would always have had like Cashel Blue, say, in the 80s, and different, we would have always had cheese board, we would have had smoked salmon, we would have eaten things that maybe not everyone else around me was eating. And yeah, so I always was into food. And then it was when I kind of got my first jobs in hospitality. So I started working at pubs from when I was like 16. But I'd say what sealed it was when I moved to London when I was 21 to go to university there. And I started working in restaurants in London. And that was really kind of solidified an interest in food. I also read Kitchen Confidential at the same time because it came out around. So it was like the early 2000s. And I remember reading that, and I was working in restaurants where the chefs I had worked with had trained, a lot of them had worked in the kitchens with Gordon Ramsay or with Marco Pierre White. And, hearing those stories, I suppose it all sounded very cool and exciting. And yeah, I was lucky then to get to eat out. I also have my dad's sister, my auntie, well, his whole side of the family are into food, but she would have been really into food as well. And she would have always brought me out. So when I first moved to London as well, they came over once a year and took me out to eat. So I got to eat in some very cool places. And I think you just get into it, don't you? And it becomes your world.
Yeah, so you kind of caught the bug through eating in restaurants. Were there any favorite spots that you remember from that time? Or any special meals that like kind of...
Yeah, I remember I didn't as a family we didn't eat out because there was when we were growing up, because there was 4 children, everything we ate was homemade. So I think the first times I would have eaten out I remember the first time I properly went for dinner, and that was with my aunt and uncle, my godparents, and we went to a Chinese restaurant which only closed in Dublin recently, and So learned how to use chopsticks. I remember the first time I ate out with my parents. We went, it was in Dingle. I think if you guys have probably been to Dingle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all I ever wanted was to eat a lobster because the supermarket we went to had a lobster tank when we were little and I had not eaten one. So I remember, I think I split a lobster with my mom one of the first times we ate out. So I remember them very specifically. And yeah, it was probably then when I moved to London that I actually took eating out as seriously, as in I would save up to go places. But I remember like every, I suppose, Michelin meal I had in London. I think one of the first ones was Richard Corrigan still had Lindsay House, which was in Soho. And I remember that was incredible because I was like, I can't believe we're eating crew beans in a Michelin restaurant. That was really, really cool to see Irish food like that. And yeah, there was a lot of them, but not a lot of them. I'd say one a year, but I saved up for them, you know.
So can you remember those meals clearly? Because sometimes I wish that after I had a meal like that, everything seemed so clear. And then a week later, a month later, I'm like, I should have taken notes. I should have written all this down because it all kind of goes into a blur.
Yeah, no. And that's a reason why I'm now very, very into taking photos of my food is because of those things.
Yeah.
And I did used to try and save menus. Yeah, I remember my first Michelin meal in Dublin in like I won't remember every course, but I remember it was in Gibo's and I remember that there was like a fig iced cream. I remember eating foie gras. I remember the cheese board. And in London, I remember one of the earliest places I went to was a place called Capital, a chef called Eric Chavot, who had 2 stars as well. And I remember the dessert because it was like a toffee popcorn dessert. But yeah, I do wish I remembered more of them specifically. I do have a box. I've just moved recently and I have a box somewhere that is from London that I think has lots of menus in it. So I am looking forward to unpacking that and going,
That's
okay,
awesome.
Yeah, if I can remember them. And yeah, there's definitely other ones. I remember like going to Le Gavroche, which is closed now. And I remember a lot of the food from there. I remember I couldn't eat for like 2 days afterwards. I'd never eaten such rich food in my entire life. And I was like, this is actually uncomfortable. But yeah, it's funny the ones you do. It's funny the ones that stand out to you. Yeah.
Were you always, when you were eating, were you always writing? Did you start with a blog? Was that something you knew you were interested in doing? How did those two things connect for you?
I actually just, writing has been my thing longer than eating, I suppose. I always wanted to write from when I was little. And then in school, I wanted to study journalism. So I did. When I finished, I studied print journalism in Dublin. It was very like news focused, like journalism. And I was really into I wanted to write for the supplements, the Sunday supplement magazines. I wanted to write for like Cosmopolitan. I wanted to do lifestyle journalism, but I suppose I didn't know it wasn't really a thing and no one I knew did anything like that. So that's why I did for a few years in Dublin, couldn't get a job. I mean, Dublin, to get it, I got a job in production, but not as a writer. You'd have to know somebody to get into like 2 or 3 of the papers. And I suppose I didn't think of myself as a serious journalist. So I moved to London I went to London College of Fashion and did a BA there it was like fashion journalism. So that was more lifestyle. And I kind of realized in that first year, which was amazing, that word fashion didn't mean I had to write about clothes, because I actually joined there. And, when I went to college there, I realized I knew nothing compared to other people who could like cite, what was on the catwalk in 1975 for Dior. And I was like, I don't know any of this. I just like bags. But because I started working in restaurants then, I had some very cool lecturers that I was able to then do my projects, and I basically did all my projects food related. So when I graduated from that, like 3 years later, I wrote my dissertation on the cultural implications of the cocktail. And my final project was a documentary called Going Glocal, which was about how shopping local can save our high street. So it was all very relevant to what I'm doing now. But I had specialized then in broadcasting, not in writing. So I ended up then I suppose I worked for a year afterwards in restaurants while I applied for TV jobs. And then I eventually got a TV job because a chef that I worked with used to do Saturday Kitchen. You know, Saturday Kitchen?
No.
And he was doing it one day, a guy called Paul Merritt, and he said, do you want to come with me and have a look and you can meet everybody? And I went there and the runner hadn't showed up. So they kind of threw the tea towel at me and I started washing the dishes and I kept on showing up every week. Then I realized I just show up and wash the dishes and eventually they gave me a job. So
it's just like working in a restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. So sorry, your question was about writing. So I was like, okay, I wasn't writing the way I do now, but then for like a decade that I was in London, I worked in food TV production. So I was writing recipes and writing briefs and writing about food in a way that I don't think until I started writing in Ireland that then I went, oh, actually, I know how to write all this. I've been writing this for like a long time. But I suppose you don't always equate it. It was actually, I was working on a TV show in Ireland and my producer said, like, you're wasted writing our briefs because you just write them and you give them to a presenter and we all think they're brilliant, but why aren't you writing for everybody else? I was like, oh, okay, I forgot about the writing. And then I suppose I weaved my way into that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Were you, like when you started on your career there, were you more interested in writing about food and culture and the lifestyle aspect of things, or were you interested in doing more criticism and reviews and that kind of thing?
No, I've never been interested. And it's funny, and you guys probably get this as well. When you do anything to do with food and media, the word people know the most is that you're a critic. So I still have people who are friends with me and go, oh, she's a restaurant critic. And I'm like, I'm not. Yeah. And I never have been. And I don't know if I would ever want to be. I really love to write about the culture of food and the worlds around it and tell the stories of it. Now, never say never, but yeah. And I think it's a hard thing I would be friends and know an awful lot of people in the industry. And same as yourself, having worked in the industry, it's very hard to be critical because if I go to a restaurant and something goes wrong, you're automatically going, okay, I've been there. I know what could be going on. And you're not necessarily going to tear it apart the way someone who maybe is a more removed can do. Right. So I admire people that only want to do that and want to keep it completely separate. But it's difficult. I think it's very hard for even anyone who even thinks they're objective to actually be objective because you're always going to be influenced by stuff around you. And
right. Or you have to completely position yourself as like on the outside of that community, which, then you're not a part of the community. You're something else and it's different. Yeah.
And it's not what I want to do. And I really admire even the old school, like say A.A. Gill or someone like that who wrote so amazingly brilliantly and didn't care what anybody thought of them. I think it's harder to be that kind of a food critic these days. It's impossible.
Yes.
Yeah. And we've worked at restaurants too, where when you're on the other side of it, if you work at a restaurant that gets a bad review, sometimes people get fired as a result. So that's something that, I don't know, colors my perspective of reading.
Yeah. But it's different, I think, in Ireland as well, compared to where you guys are, because you've been here, you know how small the world is. And how close everybody is.
Well, it's also like, I feel like so much has changed. But you mentioned you didn't go out, when you were growing up, you didn't go out to eat nearly as much, right? It was less a part of your everyday culture. It was more of a special occasion thing. It was almost like the restaurants that got reviewed were separate from your everyday life. They were these sort of special occasion, these lofty places. Yeah. But now the restaurants that are getting reviewed are like more mid-priced places, maybe pubs, casual, fast casual. It's like a whole thing. So it's definitely, there's just a lot more to it. It's a little harder to separate, to be completely outside of it when it's just, there's all kinds of restaurants.
Well, it's also making me think about how you mentioned earlier, when you were kind of entering the job market, people didn't consider food journalism to be like real journalism. And I think probably at that time, to the extent that you would read about food or restaurants in the newspaper, it would just be criticism.
Yeah. And I think that when I think back to even when I started, like in this world, which is nearly 20 years, that even the people that are interested around you, so you'd have a small group of friends, but now like everyone you know is really I know is interested in eating out and interested in food in a way that it's changed drastically in the last decade in Ireland. And it's interesting when you say that about places to write, I suppose. And when I did finish university in London, food TV was what was huge. So there wasn't loads of places to write about food, but there was so many food. There was so much food programming. Most of the stuff I did was for UK TV food. You know, you had the Food Network in America. Like there was these, you still have those things, but a lot of them now are repeats. It's almost like it got saturated. And now there's not as much money in TV. It's harder to make TV. But I was kind of working in it, I think, in like the golden age of food TV, which was a pretty cool time to be doing it at.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I miss the food TV where you could just sit down and watch and someone would be cooking and telling you about what they're doing. And it was like really simple and just like maybe two cameras and that was it. I love that where it was just like, because that was what was so interesting to me was like, let's just like have, you know, you're getting to watch someone who's an expert. It was before
like pre-competition.
Yeah, before competitions. It was also like before it was before YouTube. So you couldn't just be like, how do I make this? Let me look up a video and I'll find it. It's definitely there. So it was like felt really special to watch somebody who was an expert in their craft giving you their time and seeing what they were all about. I love that.
And you felt like they didn't need to have that big personality in the way you need to now to make it on YouTube or you know, if to do videos, social videos, you have to be everything to everyone. But this was just like, I think about like when Nigel Slater did television years and years ago, and like he still does a little bit now, but it's so comforting. I love seeing people discover the old shows as well. So people who maybe hadn't watched old Rick Stein or even Two Fat Ladies or like any of those old shows, and they're like they're so formulaic. You know what's going to happen, but it's so comforting. And yeah, you do discover something new.
Yeah, well, there's these videos of Jacques Pepin cooking now that I think are like little, they just pop up on my Facebook feed every once in a while. And it's like, he's just making eggs. He's just like making a piece of fish. And I'm like, scroll. I'm like, no, stop. This is amazing. I have to watch this all the way through. It's just the simplest thing, but it's like, you know, it's just like beautiful and perfect. And it's like, there's nothing kitschy or catchy about it. It's just like omelet.
Yeah, there's no set design involved or
He's just in his kitchen doing it. Yeah. So let's talk about the book. Let's talk about Irish Pints. Where did the idea come from? And I guess my first question was, now, how much research did you have to do for this book, or are these facts like contained in the average Irish psyche?
It's a bit of both. I always say, like, I've been researching it since I was probably 15 when I had my first pint. And even earlier, I write about it in the book. There's a chapter on ecumenical pints, which is all things related to religion in Ireland. And we make our confirmation when we're 12, and you have to take a pledge. You're supposed to take a pledge to say, I'm not going to drink until I'm 18. And I always say that I feel like that plants the seed in your head as Irish children to be like, what is this thing I'm not supposed to be doing? It's like you're automatically thinking, okay, now I've set myself a goal. When am I going to get to the pub? But the idea, I suppose it's always been there. I wouldn't have grown up in a family that went to the pub a lot. So it felt like an extra sort of special place. It wasn't like, we were, you know, my parents went all the time. And so I didn't really go to the pub until I started going myself. And I just fascinated by it from the beginning. And then I suppose over the last like few years, as I said, I'm really into writing about the culture around food and drink. And I had just written a few articles about it. I think as well, living away from Ireland, when you come home, you have much more of an appreciation of the pubs. I think that those years when I was coming home, that's all you'd want to do at Christmas time was go to the pub and be with your friends. And you realise that that doesn't exist outside of Ireland. And I suppose when I started writing about that, maybe the seed is planted for the last few years. And then like when I met Kristen, who is my publisher, Nine Bean Rose, like I've known her for years because we're both in the same world and food writing. We were at another book launch for J.R. Ryle's book Ballymaloot Desserts. And I don't know if you know J.R., he's fabulous. And he was having a party where there was champagne and cannabis and it was quite glamorous. And over in the corner, there was one tap serving pints of Guinness. And I was like, oh, there's pints over there. Will we go and get some pints when we had finished some of the champagne? And I kind of went on a soliloquy to Kristen about like how that's where all the crack is. People drink pints. And I say maybe it was in an effort for her to shut me up. She said, maybe there's a book in this. And I don't know how serious she was. And I'd say a week later, I sent her like a table of contents that probably had like 50 chapter ideas. So it was in there.
Yeah.
The facts are like you've seen the book. Yeah. You know, it's like some of it is very just observational. So some of it is just like Christmas pints, or when I write about birthday pints, or that's just my observations of those occasions. And then the factual stuff was a bit more research, because I also learned when you're writing about brands, which I'm essentially writing about, is that most of the information that's out there is marketing. So there was quite a lot of work in figuring out what was fact and what wasn't. And I do say in the book an awful lot of time, as stated by Murphy's in their book about Murphy's, as opposed to facts. And I'm not a historian, so I was intimidated, I think, a little bit about writing the history bit at the start. That took a lot of work from my end because it's a little bit different than what I would normally write. But it was very enjoyable. And I'd say the research is, outside of the pubs, the library research was some of my absolute favorite things to do, because you just go into all these different, there's so many brilliant books, Irish books written. Not enough, I don't think. That's why I was really excited to write this as well, because I felt like it's capturing a moment in time. And when I had been writing about maybe how in danger we are of losing our pub culture a little bit, that it's been really nice to put something down on paper and say, okay, it's going to be different in 5 years' time. It was different 5 years before, but now this time when I've written this book is catalogued, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I think it's a really beautiful book. And as someone who reads a lot, maybe this is like an odd thing to say, but like I really like the way it feels in my hands. It's like the perfect size also. And it's organized really well. I think that maybe people that haven't been to Ireland wouldn't entirely understand, but it's really brilliant to use pints as a lens or a way in to talk about so many different parts of Irish culture, because there are connections in here and things that you wouldn't think about if you hadn't been to Ireland before, if you didn't know the role that pints play in culture. Because you go back to how beer was made, there's just so many different aspects that you cover in here.
But like the look and feel of it was like, I have one here, was so important to me as well. Like, and you sit there, you read, like I read a lot. I am looking around this flat that I haven't unpacked yet, and it's just boxes of books about food and drink. So it was really nice to be able to work with someone who would also let me do what I wanted. And, you know, the color of it and the shape and the black and the white, and I wanted to look like a pint. And the A to Z, I suppose, it is an A to Z, but we haven't called it an A to Z, was really helpful, because I was so unsure of how I was going to make it work chapter wise, but it's worked out perfectly. And one of my favorite comments I've gotten from people is, I know loads of people who have it who don't really read and that love it, because they're like, I can just pick it up and read a chapter with a drink on a Friday. And I'm like, that's exactly like what I want. It's really cool that it is that, and that it's not something that you have to sit down and read from cover to cover. A lot of the books that I read while I was researching, or that I used from research, were very good, but a lot of them were very similar, as in it was mostly written through a male lens of a certain age, writing about pubs. So it was nice to be able to write it from a different lens, but also I felt like the look and feel made it feel a bit different. Sometimes to my detriment, because there has been a couple of bookshops where I've seen them put it in the humor section, and I'm like it'll go with those like books, those jokey Irish books, which is fine, but I'm also like I don't really want it to be there because it's not really it looks lighthearted, but there's actually a lot in it.
Yeah, maybe it'll sell 1 million copies in that area, though. Who knows, right? And get it in the airport, right?
Yeah.
I've been trying. I think it's the hardest place to get something in Ireland, and you know, it's like who you know, and I have the person who's in charge, but I still can't convince her to stock the book. So I will.
We'll send him this podcast, and it'll tip over the edge.
When I think of pints, and maybe I'm not a big beer drinker, and really when I drink beer, it's usually only Guinness. When I'm in Ireland, I'd rarely have a beer in the US. Is it safe to assume that when you're talking about pints in here, generally speaking, because I think of stout or I think of Guinness. I know there's more than just one kind of stout, but like people do have pints of Harp or different kinds of beer in Ireland, but generally speaking, most people drink stout.
Yeah, and it was hard not to write the book. Like I was quite adamant about the front having, there's a stout, there's like a red ale and a lager. There's 3 different because we'd much discussion about this because I don't want it to be just a book about Guinness because I'm like, not everybody drinks Guinness, and Guinness obviously have the lion's share of the market in Ireland and now in the UK, and there's they sell an awful lot of stout, but like it's what a lot of us drink. I know when I go to the pub, it's what I drink. It's what most people I know who drink pints drink. It wasn't always the way. Like when we were in I think it's age thing as well. I see younger people now drinking Guinness, but definitely when we were in our 20s, we weren't drinking Guinness in the pub. We were drinking, I think when you're younger, your price dictates what you drink. So you're just drinking whatever was the cheapest. And then it's like you grow into Guinness. But there's no denying that like Guinness has the chokehold on the country, on our Irishness, on what it represents. And even though it's no longer Irish owned, there's goodwill from hundreds of years of doing good things in Dublin and Ireland for Irish people that I think never goes away. And I think you can be really cynical about it, which I know a lot of people are. And I certainly have people I'm friends with in the drink world who won't drink it out of principle. And I think that's very admirable. But it's kind of like, it's just there. And one of the chapters I have in there is about brand loyalty. And I think Ireland is one of the most brand loyal, like customer bases in the world. Like you get to know something and you want it. They say that like, was Aldi or Lidl had never sold branded products until they opened in Ireland because Irish people were so we trust brands so much. And it's the same with our beer. And you can understand that because I know if I drink Guinness or if I drink Budweiser or Heineken, I know what it's going to cost in every pub. I know how much booze is going to be in it. I know how many pints I can have. Like there's a comfort to knowing all of that. So yeah, I don't know if we'll ever move away from Guinness. I think Guinness has exploded so much in the last few years as well. And I do think a lot of that is down to COVID was I think a big helper for Guinness, because when we couldn't go to the pub, it was the one thing we couldn't recreate. You could make perfect cocktails at home and you could pour beautiful wines and have your gin and tonics. You could have nice beers, but you couldn't recreate your Guinness until they then brought out the nitro surge during COVID to try and help us with that. But certainly the first thing most of us wanted to do when the pubs opened was go to the pub and get a Guinness. And I think it does bring up all stouts. Definitely Murphy's and Beamish have had a boom since the Guinness boom. There's definitely pubs in Dublin that wouldn't have either stocked or wouldn't have sold a lot of Murphy's or Beamish, and they do now. Have you had Murphy's and Beamish?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. When
Well,
you're
I
in
wanted
Cork,
to ask. Sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, it's like when you're in Cork, you're supposed to drink,
Murphy's,
it's
right?
Murphy's, it's
Yeah.
Beamish. But I think a lot of people still just drink Guinness.
The COVID, how that changed pub culture, I think is so interesting because like it's a book about pints, but it's also like a book about like pub culture specifically and
Yeah.
like gathering and
The
coming
social
together, the
aspects of
social
drinking.
aspect of it, right? And it's like what you were saying earlier about how you really started to appreciate that after being abroad and coming back. So I was wondering if you could talk about like what you see as that cultural aspect and maybe even how it ties back into some of the history that you were alluding to, like the Brown Laws and the shebeens and these places where people gathered and the way people gather in Ireland historically, and like what it is that makes this so special and such a unique part of Irish culture.
Well, yeah, again, a huge question. But I
Sorry,
suppose
yeah. Take your time.
I suppose I can highlight some of the things that stood out to me when I looked at the history of the pubs in Ireland. And the first one is probably Brehon laws, which I had known a little bit about, but not much. And that was like the native legal system in Ireland before various invasions. And one of the big parts of Brehon law was hospitality was a part of the law. So you were obliged to give hospitality in your home or anywhere. And that generosity, that obligation of generosity, as you know from being here, never goes away. So we always feel like even the word hospitality, like there's, in Ireland, you're just very, very welcoming. That's always been a part of the pub culture, even though, say, our first pubs would have been with the Normans and the English coming in. But I think how they grew in Ireland is so separate. Like if you are in the pubs in the UK, you'd never hear the word landlord in Ireland for a publican. We call them publicans, vintners. They have, they would have been considered like as important in the community as a priest or as a solicitor. Like your publican was very much part of that, of your community. And, the pub has always been, I think, in Irish community, like the democratic third space. And it still is. And that's the beauty of it, is that you can still walk into a pub. It's kind of for everybody. They're not like, yeah, the price of the pints goes up, but they're still quite democratic price wise if you want to go and spend time in them. And they've always been like that. And they've always been in the community. Like the shebeens and that part of Irish pub history is brilliant as well, because there was, when you had prohibition in America, we had the temperance movement here where they tried to get people, not the same extreme as prohibition, but they just tried to get people to stop drinking. And it did work to a certain extent, because what happened then was a lot of the pubs, there were shebeens where you could go and drink without being, anyone looking down on you. But also that was when a lot of our pubs became dual purpose pubs. So you'll see when you go around Ireland, there's a pub that's an undertaker or a grocer or a petrol station or a post office. Much like in COVID, when the pubs all had to pivot, they had to do the same during the temperance movement. So like, God, and I only scratched the surface with the history of pub culture. Like I would say I rely a lot on a friend and a colleague called Donal Fallon, who has a podcast called Three Castles Burning. He's writing a book now on the history of Dublin pubs. And like, that's going to be amazing. And there's people like him who are really knowledgeable about the social aspect. Like it's so intertwined and it's such a mammoth thing. And you can see why I was saying to you, when I wrote the first chapter of the history of the pub in Ireland or beer in Ireland, I still feel like nervous talking about it, because I feel like you can't do it justice, because it's such a huge subject matter. But keep an eye out for Donald's book, because he will do a really good job. Yeah. But as you say, there's all these little, and they're not even social nuances because they're big. There's just all these big moments that have shaped, like some of my favorites are more the ones I wrote about in my lifetime, which was like the smoking ban. Like I remember the smoking ban in pubs so clearly, and how everyone was like, this is the final nail in the coffin for pubs. Or one of my favorite chapters was writing about super pubs, and that was very much in the Celtic Tiger era, when we kind of ruined a lot of our old pubs and built these huge kind of monstrosities of super pubs. And even COVID, like all those things that have happened even in the last like few decades, like the pubs ebb and flow, I suppose, with what's happening in Ireland.
I
And
thought what you said about the when the smoking ban took place, that the lack of the tobacco smell revealed all these new smells that no one realized were there was really funny.
it's so true, because it
Yeah.
was disgusting. Like it took us so long to get used to it. And I was like, oh, and that was one of my favorite. People say, what was your favorite chapters? That was definitely one of my favorite chapters, because it just was so funny. And that was a chapter that every time I spoke to someone about it, like the stories, I had a friend who told me like she's never smoked before in her life, but like that night, which the night before the ban, she went to the pub and smoked like 20 cigarettes, and she's never smoked again, just for the sake of it, because we were like, you felt like we were being cheated, like something was being taken away from us. And now you can't even imagine smoking in the pub.
Yeah.
Drink driving was another thing. Like it was great that Ireland changed the drink driving laws. But like it changed the pubs as well. And it's still, rural pubs, I think, still struggle with that. Yeah, and it's hard because you see the pubs at the moment, you were in Galway recently, and like Dublin, and the city pubs are thriving, but anything outside of there is struggling, and that's kind of hard to see.
And then, I think this is something I learned at the Food on the Edge, was just that the overall rate of drinking in Ireland is going down. Like the statistics were like pretty surprising to me, and I was wondering if that's something you encountered in your research as well. Like, is there less drinking? Is it a different kind of drinking? How is that changing? It doesn't seem like it, right?
I had highlighted that to look up, because I was like,
like to fact check. You're like, really?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can always make facts do. His talk was brilliant, but I am interested in it because I don't know if people are drinking. Maybe they're not drinking out as much, but people are still drinking at home, and sometimes those figures get skewed. I don't know if, like, in Ireland, I think the new generation, or the younger generation now in their 20s, they definitely have more to do. And I don't think they should drink the way we did. Like, I don't think the way I drank in my 20s was particularly healthy. Probably still isn't now. But like, our lives revolved around going out. I've done okay from it now because I've written a book about it, but like, it's not for everybody, and it's hard to, if you live in a world, if in that environment, and you don't have a healthy relationship with alcohol, or you struggle with that, like, it is really hard. So it is nice to see the country changing, and people are into more activities than just going to the pub. But you also don't want to lose the pub. What I really like to see is the pubs that have become that kind of are adjusting with stuff, like that are putting on more activities, or that are offering the pub space up for meetups that don't necessarily involve drinking, even having a big low and no alcohol menu, which most places do now, which is brilliant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Guinness Zero has been an incredible drink, because it's kind of finally nailed a drink that feels and tastes like you're having a drink when you go out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's definitely changing. It's not terrible if our attitude to drink changes at all. But yeah, I have a chapter in there where I write about figuring out how to preserve the pubs, because that's my worry. And there isn't, the front of the buildings can be preserved, but there's nothing about preserving the makeup of the pub and the tangible bits inside the pub, and even those pub grocers that we're talking about. And I'd love to see something else done to preserve the pub, to be supports there. There's a lot of people worried about closing, and those pubs will close and they will be gone, and it will be too late a bit like with the super pubs when we ruined them. That's kind of worrying. So you're not just preserving the look and feel of the pub, you want to preserve the community and I suppose those tangible, like untangible aspects of it. It's hard to, I suppose, figure out how to do that.
Yeah. Right, because you want to preserve them, but you don't want to preserve them in like a museum sense, right? You want to preserve like what they're actually doing.
Oh, I would as well. I'm like, I think it's crazy that we don't have a pub museum.
Yeah.
When you look at the Guinness Storehouse, which essentially is the closest thing to it, but it's a one brand, and you know it's the busiest visitor attraction that we have in Ireland. If it's not one of the busiest in the world, it's crazy. And that we don't have a pub museum and that there isn't that. And I write in there about the, you know, there's been conversations about applying for the Irish pub for a UNESCO heritage, like Berlin with the clubs or Paris has done with the baguette or something. And it would be cool to see something like that happen, but I don't know who. I think the VFI, which is the Vintners Federation of Ireland, have done something along those lines, but I don't know if something like that can happen. It would be amazing if it could, and I would be an advocate for it. And yeah, it'd be great to have a pub museum.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be really cool. Now that you say it like that would be amazing.
I mean, it's certainly one of the top 5, if not the number one thing that tourists want to do when they come to Ireland is go to a pub, and everybody talks about wanting to go to, you know, a real pub, like an Irish pub, as you might call it. Yeah, I guess on that note, do you have or do you feel comfortable saying, like, do you have some favorite pubs that you like or that you think are special?
So many.
I guess it depends on where, you know, also. City pubs,
it depends on where you are.
Pubs, yeah.
And I think that I write about it in the book, like the chapter on the old man's pub, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about that pub, and that it's very specific. There's a look and a feel and a plainness to it in a way. It can be really plain or it can be full of paraphernalia as well. In Dublin, like last week, I just went to Peter's Pub. I don't know if you know that. Is it on South William Street? And it's really plain, and they're always a little bit grumpy when you go in sometimes. Maybe they don't want you to move. We came in and we sat down, but then there was people besides that tried to move their tables, and you're like, you're not allowed to move the tables. And I was like, you can't move the tables in here. I don't know why. But they just have like their rules, and it's kind of a part of the makeup of the pub.
Yeah.
And I always say, like, the Gravediggers, which is a really obvious one, but I love it because it's been, you know, it's one of the pubs I've drank in for a long time. And everyone's in there taking pictures of their pints and they're rolling their eyes at you for taking pictures, but they also don't care. They love it. That's part of the attitude of it. So I do love a pub that has a bit of an attitude. And like Dublin, we're spoiled. You've got places like Keogh's, which is absolutely packed all of the time. But when you go in, you know you're going to get served within a few minutes. Like, the service actually is probably the most important part, because a pub can have everything else, but you want to be able to go in and know that whoever's behind the bar looks up and can take 6 orders at a time. That's what you want. I was down in Dingle recently, and like all the pubs can do that. They all have proper trained people working there. And yeah, that's the worry of the newer pubs with younger staff, without making me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but like they don't care about how they're serving you or what they're serving you.
Right.
And I'd love to make sure that, like, you want that old school service to survive. That would be one thing that would be worrying in Irish pubs, but you'll still get it most places. But
yeah, I mean, from living in New York, like, and working in restaurants, and you get off your shift and you go out and all you want to do is drink, and you go to a bar and you're like, I've been standing here, I want to drink a beer. Like, it's been 5 minutes. Like, make eye contact with me. Like, what's happening here? And like, I do know exactly what you're talking about when you go to incredibly a busy pub and they are like, they're just on it and they just catch your eye and it's happening. And it's
There's
like
nothing like
it
it.
makes it seem really easy, but there's obviously like a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of the operations and the training and who you hire and how, some of that stuff that people don't really think about, right?
Yeah, and it's funny because I think part of why I wrote about pints and pints specifically is because going for pints is really straightforward. You're
Okay.
not getting cocktails, you're not getting complicated drinks. So the service is going to be quick. You know how much it's going to cost. It's going to be quite straightforward. So there is that simplicity to it. And yeah, those pubs that like probably don't. I mean, it's different in New York. You have people who are well able to make cocktails, but like in Ireland, like unless you're going to somewhere very specific, you're not going to necessarily be getting a good cocktail, and you're going to be waiting a long time for it. So it's like pints are a better choice most of the time. But yeah, the service is a big part of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered my question about pubs. I gave you a few.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It was making
It's
me
always
think
hard
of,
because I say, as you said, like it depends on where you are and it's subjective, the time of day, who you're with, what you're in the mood for. And like there's a pub for every I suppose occasion that's going to suit you.
Yeah. Well, it's noon here right now and I'm getting thirsty. So
yeah, but yeah, will you find an Irish pub
No.
in Michigan? I don't know. It's a good question.
What was the most surprising thing that you learned while writing or researching this book?
Definitely writing about women in pubs. I started drinking in pubs in like the late 90s legally, I suppose, about 98. And I never thought twice about drinking a pint. I started drinking pints from when I started going to the pub. I like beer. I've always liked beer. I prefer it to spirits. I wasn't a good spirit drinker. And I just always drank pints and I never thought about it. And you might get the odd comment, but for the most part, I grew up with a mixed group of girls and boys that we all went to the pub together, and there wasn't like girls drink this and boys drink that. And I suppose you start to see a little bit of that around you, but you're like, nah. And there were definitely people I knew who were like, oh God, my mother tells me not to drink a pint. And I'd be like, okay, you're crazy because like it's cheaper and it's nicer or whatever. But then looking at the history of women in pubs to realize that like 20 or even 10 years before I started drinking, that wouldn't have been the same experience for me. So to think about the fact that women weren't allowed in the pub up until like the 60s or 70s in Ireland, and that even when they were allowed into the pub, that they weren't allowed to drink pints, and you would have to like split a pint or drink a half pint or have something else. And that was so close to around the time that I started drinking is weird, because I'm writing now about things that happened 20 years ago, like the smoking ban. But when I was drinking 20 years before then, to think that I mightn't have been able to drink pints, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. And the more I spoke to people about it, the more people had stories and said, I remember I couldn't drink this, or I would never have drank a pint. And that technically it was not illegal in Ireland until the changes in the Equality Act in 2000. I don't think people still turned women away from drinking pints, but technically you still could have. That was kind of, I suppose, a bit of an eye-opener to think about that.
Just to think about how recent it was, essentially, that change happened or that shift happened.
Yeah. Just like, I never questioned my right to drink a pint. And to think that even, I think the 90s changed, I don't know about, but for us here, there was a lot of like ladette culture and like girls drink pints too. And I suppose that is around you. So you just think it's normal, but like it wouldn't have been maybe in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's still pubs now that, I think now no pub will ever not want someone to come into they'll serve anybody if they're overage. But there definitely was still pubs that you'd feel uncomfortable going into as a woman. Or that you get looked up and down, or you maybe wouldn't want to go on your own. And I think, I don't know if there's less of them now or if I don't care anymore. So I don't really worry about it. I think when you get older, it's different than if you're like a 21-year-old doing that, drinking a pint on your own. But yeah, I was thinking about, I suppose, a woman's relationship with a pint was really interesting.
I think a lot of our listeners might not really understand what I would call the subject of like pub etiquette, you know, going to a pub with a group of friends and buying rounds, or even the fact that there is a way that you're supposed to pour a pint of stout, because we are in the business of bringing people to Ireland, and, you know, we'll go to a pub with someone who's never been in Ireland before and they don't understand why their pint is left sitting on the bar when it's not completely full, and they're like, why are you just standing there talking to somebody? Like, why don't you just give me my pint? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the perfect pint is supposed to be poured, and then the etiquette of going to the pub with your friends.
And that actually happened last week when I was in Galway with I was with someone who was English, actually, so I was surprised, but she was like, is he going to finish those? Are they ready? Like, what's happening? And we all laughed because I just thought she was taking the piss. I was like, surely, I you know, it's maybe an American might know. I was like, surely English people know about that, but yeah, not everybody knows. So the 2-part pour is just like, it's just ingrained as an Irish person. You don't even think that it's unusual that when your pint is poured, it's poured in 2 parts. So the barman or bar person will pour 2/3 of it essentially first, let it settle. So the white, you know, this white separates the head from the black stout, and then they top it up and hand it over to you. And it's supposed to have a little domage on top, and it's supposed to be quite set. And then you wouldn't drink it until it's set again yourself. I have the timings in the book. They do have specific, is it 119 seconds or something? But there is very specific timings. But like, I worked in a bar for years. It's one of the first things that you learn. There's other particular things in, like, you always give the pint in the correct branded glass. You always serve it kind of facing the customer. You usually always put a beer mat down or a beer mat beside it. And they're things that I didn't think were particularly Irish until you go away from it. And I remember in the bars in the UK, they just give you anything. And I was like, any glass. Over one of the other, an Instagram account that became huge over COVID is Shit London Guinness. Do you know that?
Yeah.
And like, that was because an Irish guy moved to London and he kept on getting served Guinness in like the wrong glass or not poured correctly. And then he posted them on Instagram. And of course, the whole of Ireland and anyone who's ever been to Ireland was outraged by it. And he has an awful lot of Instagram followers. And it's great fun because, like, again, I talked about Guinness and how amazing they are at branding. And like, all we're doing is like buying into the story that they sold. Right. Because the thing about the 2-part pour is, some people say it's marketing lore and we don't need to do it anymore. And other bar people will swear that if you don't do the 2-part pour, your pint is going to be floppy. It's not going to be correct. It's an interesting thing to do blind taste tests with people. I don't think most people can tell, but
interesting.
I've only ever done that after a few drinks. So it's hard to figure it out. But again, it adds to that love we have for Guinness because it makes us feel like it's a special drink. It makes you feel like there's a ritual attached to it. It makes you feel like we're in on something. And then when Americans come and they don't understand what it is, you're like, oh, well, you have, you know, as you know, Irish people love telling stories. We love chatting. So even for the bar staff to be able to like tell that little story to people, I think it's great, and it's all very fun. But yeah, the 2-part pour it does have a history and it is relevant, and I think it's a good thing because
it's like when it contributes to this feeling that it's just one more thing that's special about
it's part of the pageantry,
the Irish, pint experience. It's not the only thing, but it's like, it like if when you see them all lined up there, with the 2/3 pour, that's like a very unique sight, I guess. So
oh my god, it's genius when you think about it because it looks great. And when you go to pubs like Coe's or the Gravediggers or Toners where they're pouring 20 pints in a go and they're all sat up there at the bar, if I'm there. And I don't know what it is. I'm going to be like, what's that? I want one of them. It's like when someone pours an Aperol Spritz, everyone all of a sudden is like, I'm going to have Aperol Spritz. It just has that, it looks great. Like it's aesthetically pleasing and it ticks all the boxes.
Yeah. It's like, no, you will wait another 2 minutes for that pint.
And you will love it that much more.
You asked me something else there as well about the 2-part pour. What was the other part?
Oh, about buying rounds, about buying rounds when you go to the pub. Because definitely Americans don't understand that.
Yeah, I did a chapter on rounds. And it's actually been one of the things that most people have contacted me about to say thank you. Mostly people that are married to someone Irish or married someone Irish. And there's, it's been a constant battle of trying to explain the importance of rounds. But the Irish round, I think, goes back to the Brehon laws where it was ingrained in us to be hospitable. You had to provide hospitality. You wanted to be seen as being generous. And I think one of the biggest fears for an Irish person is to be thought of as ungenerous or stingy or tight. You don't want to have that reputation. So buying around, if you're going for a pint with someone, you're kind of automatically like, you'd never go to the pub and say, I'll get my own drink if you're with somebody else. If you're with, like, maybe when you're students or you're with like your best friends or whatever, but in general, it's just polite to getting around. And you're in the round, you have to commit to it. I write about the intricacies of it in the book. Is like, these days you shouldn't feel pressurized into drinking. If you don't want to be in a round, you just go, okay, I don't want to be in the round. For the most part, you're in the round until the round is finished or until people have had too many drinks to remember exactly what's happening. But the idea is you just are taking turns buying drinks. But you should be, I suppose, pints are helpful because they're all a similar price point. Like, you don't want to be in a round and start drinking like top shelf whiskey or and you could take a break yourself on your own rounds. Like, that was a really fun chapter to write because it was one of those things that I know intrinsically so much about it, but I had never gone, how do I put this down on paper? Because so much of it is unspoken and so much of it is an expected knowledge that you're meant to have, and you might not have it, but in Ireland you will always have it.
Well, I love the way that the pints in Ireland can, it makes the whole rounds thing a lot easier. Like, there's obviously sometimes pressure to be like, oh, I'll get this one. We have, that's cultural here as well, but it's turns. Like kind of annoying to do it when someone has a martini and someone has a Negroni and someone's drinking this kind of beer. It's like, no, I'll just go get the next round. It's so easy, Yeah,
and if you're all on cocktails, that's fine. But but on pints, you'd never do it. And I was in Kyo's recently, and there was, I think, maybe some German tourists behind us, and they had like already done the maths when they went to the bar and sent everybody a Revolut request. And I was like, I could hear it, and I was like, oh my God, like, fair enough, you just want to pay for your own drinks, but it sort of takes a little bit away from the conviviality of going for pints if you're doing up a little spreadsheet for a round.
Wow, that's like
I had one of my friend I interviewed for the book, Judith Boyle. She's like, there's a thing called drink karma in Ireland. And I was like, what? She's like, it'll always come back to you. So like, we've all done that where we bought an extra round or we bought a drink, but it balances out because you're going to be in a situation another time where you don't get the chance to buy the round. Like, it will always balance out.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to look at it.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask a little bit about, just to change gears a little bit, and ask about some of the organizing of food festivals that you've done. So you've been involved in some of the most, some of the greatest and most recognizable food festivals that have been happening in recent years, like the Big Grill Festival. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that work and how that came to be. And, I love the idea that it connects in some way to this idea of gathering around food and how important that is, culturally. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing world to be in. And I think that, I suppose I had the background in food TV production, and it's essentially the same thing. I used to produce conversations for on screen, and now I'm producing conversations in fields, which is essentially what I do. But I started first, I think when I moved back to Ireland, I worked for a year with a chef, Clodagh McKenna. She had introduced me to a lot of different people in food. And then I went freelance and I did a course in like social media. I blagged my way to doing the social media for Taste of Dublin. Because it was the very early days of social media where not really, it was very basic what I was doing, but I had a knowledge about food and I knew how to talk about it. So I started doing the social for Taste of Dublin. And from that, I ended up doing the social for the Big Grill. But once I started doing that with the guys who owned the Big Grill, they were like, oh, you could probably do that. I was like, well, I have this other idea and this other idea. And then I got involved in the curation side of things. And then that led on to, I was doing a lot of stuff with Eat Yard, which is body tonic. It used to be it was the first kind of, I suppose, street food market that we had in Dublin. And we had a stage there. We used to do events and I was organizing them. And I think the guy who owned it was like, well, why don't you just host them as well? So slowly it developed into, okay, I can do this. And now it's probably 50% of my time is doing that and 50% of my time is writing. And I really need the festival stuff because, as you know, writing isn't exactly the easiest way to make a living. So doing the festival events is amazing because they're a lot of work, but like it's so brilliant. So now I do Beyond the Pale, which is a music and arts festival. Then I still do a little bit on the Big Grill. I'm doing another one next year that I will be talking about soon. And then I do lots of little ones. So, or just consults on, one-off events. I feel like this summer I've been doing something like every 3 weeks, which is great. Either hosting a talk or curating a talk. But I think as a journalist, it's a really nice way to have conversations because we're really lacking in, even though Kate, you were saying there's loads of different kinds of food writing now in places. We're actually really lacking in places to write about food and to speak about food. There's not very many spaces left in the broadsheet papers in Ireland. There's not very many online places to write about food anymore. So a lot of the conversations that I think are important are happening in the fields at festivals. And that's really, really cool. I always think maybe we should be recording them, but we don't. And that's kind of nice that they just happen and people can say whatever they want. And you're having a drink while you're chatting. There's like your barriers are really down and we have really interesting chats. I really enjoy the festival side of things.
That's great. Yeah. What an interesting, I was thinking, you should record them, but there is something really like kind of, I guess, freeing about not recording things as well in this day and age, especially, right?
Yeah. And, I love it. And again, when you talk about like the Irish history, like I'd written about food festivals a lot in the last few years as well. And to look back at our history, it's always been how Irish people have always had festivals. Like it's always been how you socialized through way, way, way back into the pagan festivals and the quarter days of the year. And it's almost like it's a bit like the pub is in our culture. Festivals are in our culture long before pubs were even a thing. So it always feels like a kind of happy place that you are. You're cut off from everything for like 2 or 3 days and you're only concentrating on the people that are around you and having a good time and enjoying yourselves. And to have food conversations in the middle of all that is really, really cool. I don't think it happens in, I looked up all of the UK festivals to see if there's similar stuff. They don't seem to have the same food focused stages that we seem to have here. And I don't know why. It's taken off here and every festival now feels like they need to have, the music, the arts and the food, which is brilliant because it means there's more places for us to do things. But and I think people taking food more seriously as a cultural subject that really helps as well. Yeah
It's I've done so many of these like tasting events, as on the chef side of things, where you've got your table and everyone's walking around and you're putting out bites of food, and it's like, but there's no real organized conversation, and it feels like to be putting a stage together where people are actually talking about stuff and you're eating seems so important to actually making these events feel significant and
like the
making
story
connections.
should always be.
I kind of made a conscious decision a few years ago. It was half practical, half conscious, not to do demos as much. So there's festivals like Taste of Dublin and festivals where people come to watch a chef cook a recipe, and that's great, and that's separate. I'm definitely more into, I don't want you to do a cooking demo, but I want you to come and talk about something that's really interesting. Bring stuff we can taste, bring something we can talk about, bring drinks, but like it's the conversation and the subject matter. And it does make people a little bit more nervous because maybe they're used to going behind the recipe and going, okay, I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful apple tart today, and then they get to talk about their food through that. But to take away the act of doing the demo and concentrate more on the conversation, I've been really enjoying that. And like people, you always, like I'm nervous before every single one that I do, always, even if I know it's going to be great, like, because you're always like, are people going to be interested? And like they are. The nicest thing about those festivals is that people aren't there specifically for the food conversation. They might know nothing about food, but they stumble upon your stage and they sit down and they listen, and they might just do one talk, but they generally will come back a few more times over the weekend. And I love to see that you're kind of spreading the word further out than you would just at a food festival.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
What's next on your agenda? Do you have your sights on a second book project? Are you happy to take a break after all the effort that went into Irish Pints?
I would be very happy to take a break, but like I won't, because it's kind of like there's good momentum on Irish Pints. What I'm trying to concentrate on in Irish Pints now is to get it outside of my world, because I think everyone in Ireland knows about it. I want to, it's great to chat to you guys because I definitely want to try and bring it to America next year. I know we have a distributor, but I suppose try to figure out to do some events. I've got some events booked in the UK for the book next year already. And while I'm doing that, I am starting a compendium part 2. Number 2? Part 2 makes it sound like it's a follow-on. It's not really, but it sort of is. But I do have the second book in table of content stages, I suppose. And I did think I want to give it a rest, but like the actual act, like I was saying, of the research and the writing, like it's definitely the nicest way I've ever gotten to write. Articles, you just always so impeded by your word count, and I don't think I ever get to put my personality into my writing when I'm writing 1,200 words exactly on something. And it was really nice to write this and get it out to the world and people to say, oh, your writing was funny, or I liked how you discussed that. And I think it's an amazing opportunity to do another book. So I will definitely, I'm going to do it. So next time I talk to you, we'll have another subject, but something that's still very, very, very Irish and in a very similar vein.
Cool. Well, we can't wait to hear about it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very suspenseful. It's a very suspenseful way to end the interview. Stay tuned.
Thanks. Well, it's because I haven't fully convinced my publisher on this subject, but I'm almost there.
Yeah, you'll get there.
Yeah.
Just, all you need is another
couple rounds.
Yeah, another few rounds.
Yeah,
exactly.
I know. I'll just take her for a few pints and the contract will be signed and that will be it.
You'll have a deep and meaningful. Was that what they're called? The deep and meaningfuls? Yeah. The D&M. That's in there. The different,
exactly. Pints, flats. Yeah.
Dyed Green is a project of Bog and Thunder, whose mission is to highlight the best of Irish food and culture through food tours, events, and media. Find out more at www.bogandthunder.com.